Hey everyone, I'm Sean Ryan, a technical writer on the content team here at mParticle. As part of our data quality video series, I recently caught up with Jodi Bernardini, a senior solutions consultant here at mParticle, to discuss how companies can avoid the consequences of bad data. As someone who works to help our enterprise customers solve data-related challenges every day, Jodi has great insight into managing data quality at scale. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I wanted to talk to Jodi about how companies can head data quality issues off at the pass. In our conversation, he laid out three major threats to data quality that companies should look out for and offered some guidance on how to avoid them. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Jodi, before we get into talking about threats, when you think about data quality, what comes to mind?
There's a couple of things. There's consistency of your data, making sure that the data is arriving in the right way. And then it's also being able to easily find out when the data is not consistent. When we talk about data quality, like we're talking about how the data looks, like the typecasting of the data, the naming of the data, making sure it's consistent. The most important thing of data quality is being able to leverage that data as quickly, as easily, as intuitively as possible downstream in your system. So like when your marketers are going to use the data, they don't need to kind of like look through a bunch of documentation and be like, how do I leverage this? What is a purchase? What is a transaction? It's not only like how the data is arriving, but there's certain pieces of data that can't be missing. If somebody purchases something, you're going to need to know a quantity. Like you're going to need to know the price. You're going to need a quantity. You're going to need to know the name of the item, because you don't want to find out like, hey, we implemented this thing, and then 3 months later you find out, oh man, we weren't capturing the quantity with our purchases. We were capturing the name and the price. We've seen very expensive situations where customers build something and then down the line, they're like, this actually doesn't do what we needed it to do. So they need to go back in and fix it. So if you introduce that layer, it will basically be able to find those issues up front.
Threat number one, relying too heavily on developers to manually ingest data from different sources.
The source of this data tends to be whatever POS system you're using, whatever transaction platform you're using,
Right.
You know, and it's in whatever schema they have. So you need to be able to interpret their schema to begin with. You might be using a bunch of different platforms for your different apps. So you'll need to understand for different platforms, their different schemas, and know what's the useful data between them. It's always a risk when that data engineering team is going to need to maintain code to integrate with these multiple APIs, right? They're going to need to spend significant time, one, building, and then a significant amount of time maintaining. And that means whenever there is API changes to these platforms, whenever there are new regulations that come in that might change, how data can and will be collected. The biggest thing that I'll see is that oftentimes the person that builds the platform to begin with is no longer there when it needs to get updated. And these things need to get updated frequently. You need to be an expert on not just one API, but on a ton of different APIs. Oftentimes what we'll see is like, hey, somebody will write it to the individual spec of what they needed at the time, but then this needs to, iOS 15 comes out, and then it's like, oh, okay, now we need to update this code. Who originally wrote this code? Are they still here? A lot of times they're like, hey, that developer is no longer here. Somebody's going to need to spend a lot of time refamiliarizing themselves with the landscape. You're never going to have an engineering team that's focused specifically on data ingest and data egress from your platform, because you're building specific solutions for each one. You're going to come in for a project, build this, and then move on to another project. And your entire scope is going to change. And then by the time you come back, even if it's the same dev, you might be coming back in 9 months and being like, what did I write 9 months ago? I need to relearn all of this stuff.
Threat number two, not having a consistent data schema to use across development teams and data sources.
When you are building this directly from the app and going directly to these outbound destinations, you're going to have a different iOS developer than an Android developer, than a web developer, than a Roku developer, etc. And they're going to build it in different ways. They might name it different things. They might use different casing, right? And how they feed that data in might not be consistent if they're not having some kind of data quality layer in between. You might be getting great data for iOS. You might be getting great data from Android. But if those two pieces of data, or those two streams of data, aren't consistent, then you can't really match them up together. You can't really compare them. You can't really say like, oh, my Android users are doing this, my iOS users are doing this, because the data inherently is in a different schema, is in a different form, and you don't have a holistic view of what your users are doing. Historically, the way customers have done this has really been like, hey, I'm going to give my developers this Excel spreadsheet around like what we're expecting to be collected. Whether or not they adhere to it is kind of up to the developer, right? Because once it's working and it's shipped and it's been tested and you're like, hey, yeah, data's getting in there, I can confirm it, pretty much job's done. And it's very manual. this is a problem, is that when you're building this stuff, if you don't have like a schema to compare it against before you ingest that data, you're really very manually just like looking at like expected data versus received data. And you really need to backtrack on that. You really need to like trace it backwards and be like, okay, how come this isn't adhering to this model that I'm expecting, that I'm looking at in this Excel sheet? Not a lot of customers, unless you're already using a CDP, are facilitating it. They don't have the infrastructure of their data to go through this kind of tunnel to make sure that it's adhering to the schema first and then going outbound.
Threat number 3, not using intuitive structures for naming conventions for your data.
When you talk about data quality, it's not just the names, not just the data points you want to collect, right? It's also what the data looks like. You know that quantity is always going to be a number, right? You know that price is always going to be a number. And we also want to make sure that these data points, like product underscore price, product underscore quantity, it's going to be like intuitive, right? We've seen a lot of times where like customers are coming over from other implementations, they're transforming their data into, hey, this is what we're going to capture to mParticle. And we'll look at it and be like, are you sure you want your data to look like this? Because nobody's going to make sense of this when they look at it.
Right.
It's really powerful to have intuitive data, because that immediately allows you, if you're using mParticle, if you're using Braze, if you're using Amplitude, you want to be able to easily say like, oh, hey, let me filter on users that are iOS users. You don't want that to be some kind of random, string of characters to determine like their platform. It should be like platform type. You could say like, okay, cool, I know exactly what that is. Or I could say product name, and I know exactly what that is. Show me everybody that's bought an orange chicken bowl from Panda Express. And I can look at, show me every purchase where the product name is orange chicken bowl. We've seen a lot of customers that come in because they've used like these single platforms before. They've used like Salesforce, they've used Adobe, or they've fallen into their schema where like a product name might be like P_N, it might be like $PN, it might be like underscore, quantity or underscore QTY or things like that are semi-intuitive, but not quite intuitive enough. Beyond that is like, we want to make sure the data type is there. Like if you immediately look at product quantity and it comes in as like ABC, you're going to look at that and be like, hey, that's wrong.
Jodi, what advice would you give companies to help them ensure data quality from the point of ingestion?
I would say model your data up front rather than model it as you go,
Mm-hmm.
right? You want to know what are your expectations up front rather than, hey, we got in the middle of planning this API and capturing the data and like, this is what they have available, so let's grab X, Y, and Z. When we start running through our implementations at mParticle, up front, we do a data planning session where we say, what are the important data points to capture? We do that by looking at what are the use cases they want to achieve. Like, hey, we want to increase customer loyalty. Hey, we want to drive more app adoption. Panda Express is one of our customers, and they want to drive more account creations. They want to, more loyalty members. So when somebody purchases something, they want to be able to, on a purchase, send an email right on the back of that and say like, hey, you could have, gained 50 Panda points but with this purchase or something along those lines. So when we look at those kind of use cases, we'll be like, okay, well, the purchasing funnel is really important. Add to carts, remove from carts, purchases, capturing email address, being able to forward that. And when we start looking at those, we'll look at, hey, when somebody adds to cart, these are the important points that we want to capture with that add to cart event. When somebody purchases, these are the important data points to capture. For us to be able to achieve this use case, you're going to want to know all these pieces of data. So we'll explicitly lay that out. We'll kind of run through all that to make sure, hey, this is what the data should look like. These are the important data points to capture. And then we'll convert that into a data plan, right? We'll convert that into our schema that will, when you ingest that data into mParticle, we'll say like, hey, you wanted to capture store ID when you were in your add to cart form, but this isn't flowing in. Let them know immediately and they'll be like, okay, crap, somewhere in our code we messed up and we didn't pass store ID along with this event.
Jodi, how can companies do data planning in a way that helps ensure data quality?
You can't use your data if it's not in the right format, right? And if it's not named correctly, you don't even know what to look for. I always say tie it back to use cases. To me, like everything always needs to get tied back to use cases because that will drive your data collection, it will drive your data quality, it will drive everything that you want to do. Because when you know exactly what you want to do with your data, it's very easy to say, these are the data points we need to collect. It's very easy to say, this is how we should name them because we want to leverage them in this way. So tying that all back together to use cases, to valid marketing use cases, to know how you're going to utilize that data is ultra important. And everything will come from that. Your data naming will come from that. The typecasting for it will come from that. Making it human readable, making sure you're not over collecting data instead of focusing on the important bits of data.
Hopefully this conversation helped you identify some practices or lack thereof that could potentially threaten the quality of your customer data, and gave you some sound advice on ways to mitigate them in your organization. Thanks for watching, and check out the other videos in the playlist for more on how to manage data quality.